The autumn sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Paulson Hall, casting long golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors of Lecture Room 104. Professor Thomas Wilson adjusted his navy blue tie and glanced at his watch. 3 minutes until his advanced theoretical physics class would begin. He smiled to himself as he arranged his notes on the podium, enjoying the soft murmur of students filing in. At 34, Thomas was the youngest tenured professor in Harvard's prestigious physics department. His meteoric rise through academia had been fueled by equal parts brilliant research, political savvy, and an unwavering self-confidence that some colleagues privately called arrogance. His students nicknamed him the peacock behind his back, not just for his tendency to dress in colorful blazers, but for how he strutted around campus as if the ground was honored to support his weight. "Professor Wilson," called a voice from the front row. It belonged to David Chen, an eager graduate student who never missed an opportunity to curry favor. "I read your new paper on quantum entanglement." "Absolutely groundbreaking stuff," Thomas nodded with practiced humility. "Thank you, David. Always nice to be appreciated." He turned to write the day's topic on the whiteboard, allowing himself a small smile. His recent publication in the Journal of Theoretical Physics had indeed caused quite a stir, though the most respected voices in the field had yet to weigh in. As the lecture hall filled with bright-eyed students clutching expensive textbooks and steaming coffee cups, Thomas surveyed his domain. Every seat would be filled today, as always. His classes were notorious for their difficulty but had waitlists stretching into the dozens. Nothing pleased him more than seeing these young minds hanging on his every word, watching their expressions shift from confusion to enlightenment as he unveiled the mysteries of the universe. "Let's begin," Thomas announced exactly at 10 Har, not needing to ask for quiet. The room fell silent immediately. "Today we're continuing our exploration of supersymmetry and its implications for the Standard Model." He launched into his lecture with practiced precision, his hands dancing through the air as he described complex mathematical relationships as if they were old friends. 20 minutes in, deeply engrossed in explaining a particularly challenging concept, a movement at the back of the hall caught his eye. The heavy oak door had opened quietly, and an elderly woman was slipping into the lecture hall. Thomas faltered mid-equation. In his 6 years teaching at Harvard, he'd seen the occasional visitor, colleagues, prospective students, even university donors, but never someone like her. She appeared to be in her mid-70s with silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a faded blue cardigan over a floral dress that looked like it belonged to another decade. As she carefully made her way down the steps toward an empty seat in the back row, Thomas noticed her slightly unsteady gait and the worn leather handbag clutched in her wrinkled hands. The students had noticed too. Heads turned and puzzled glances were exchanged. A few whispers broke out, disrupting the perfect attention Thomas had commanded just moments before. "As I was saying," he continued, raising his voice slightly to regain control of the room, "when we consider the symmetry breaking at high energy levels." But his rhythm had been broken. The unexpected visitor nagged at the edge of his awareness like an equation with a missing variable. Was she lost? Perhaps a retiree who wandered into the wrong building, or someone's grandmother here to surprise them. Whatever the explanation, her presence felt like an intrusion into his carefully ordered world. Thomas continued his lecture, but his eyes kept drifting back to the old woman. To his surprise, she wasn't looking around in confusion or fidgeting like someone who'd made a mistake. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her attention fixed on him with unnerving intensity. More curiously, she had taken out a small notebook and was occasionally jotting down notes with a pencil. Her head tilted in concentration. The absurdity of it struck him suddenly. This elderly woman, who looked like she should be knitting in a rocking chair somewhere, was acting like she understood his advanced physics lecture. A lecture that even his brightest undergraduates struggled to follow. "Excuse me," Thomas said, pausing his explanation of a complex mathematical proof. The lecture hall fell silent. "I don't believe we've met." He directed his gaze to the back of the room where the old woman sat, all heads turned to look at her. Under the collective stare of 60 students and one increasingly irritated professor, most people would have shrunk with embarrassment. The woman merely looked up from her notebook with calm, clear eyes. "No, we haven't had the pleasure," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady and clear. Please don't let me interrupt your lecture, Professor. It's quite fascinating. Something about her composed response, the lack of apology, the hint of assessment in her tone, pricked at Thomas's pride. Who was this woman to walk into his classroom unannounced and then act as if she were evaluating him? Actually, he said, forcing a smile, I always encourage participation from everyone in the room. Since you find the material fascinating, perhaps you'd care to join our discussion? A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the usual warm, if demanding, Professor Wilson they knew. There was an edge to his voice now, a hint of challenge that seemed out of proportion to the minor disruption. The woman folded her hands over her notebook. If you wish, Thomas's smile tightened. Let's start with something simple then. Can you tell us what we mean by supersymmetry in this context? He expected confusion, perhaps an awkward admission that she was indeed in the wrong place. Instead, the woman nodded thoughtfully. Supersymmetry proposes a symmetry between fermions and bosons, suggesting that for every known particle, there exists a superpartner with a spin that differs by half a unit. It offers a potential solution to the hierarchy problem and provides a candidate for dark matter, she answered, her tone conversational, as if explaining how to bake bread rather than outlining one of physics's most complex theories. Thomas blinked. The answer was textbook perfect. Perhaps too perfect. She must have memorized it from somewhere, he decided. Anyone could parrot definitions, correct, he said coolly. And what are the implications for the mass of these theoretical superpartners? Around the room, students leaned forward, the usual shuffle of notebooks and laptops falling silent. The atmosphere had shifted from mild embarrassment to genuine curiosity. The woman in the back row had become the most interesting part of the morning's lecture. She smiled slightly before answering. The most mathematically elegant models would place superpartner masses at the electroweak scale, but experimental data from the Large Hadron Collider has pushed those limits higher, creating what some call the little hierarchy problem. This has led to modified theories suggesting heavier superpartners or more complex braking mechanisms. Thomas felt a prickle of unease run down his spine. Her answer wasn't just correct. It showed an understanding of both the theoretical foundations and current experimental challenges. He glanced at his students, noting their rapt attention. David Chen's mouth had actually fallen open slightly. What had begun as an attempt to gently embarrass an intruder and regain control of his classroom was becoming something else entirely. Thomas felt a competitive spark ignite within him. He'd built his reputation on being the smartest person in any room. He wasn't about to be upstaged by an elderly woman who looked like she belonged in a library reading romance novels. Interesting, he said, walking slowly across the front of the lecture hall. Since you seem so well versed in the subject, perhaps you could share your thoughts on the connection between supersymmetry and string theory? Specifically, how supersymmetry might be preserved in compactified dimensions. This question ventured beyond the scope of his undergraduate course. It was the kind of topic that came up in specialized graduate seminars, not introductory lectures. Several students were already pulling out their phones, surreptitiously searching for information. Thomas felt a twinge of satisfaction. Finally, he would expose this woman's limits. As the woman considered her response, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Thomas noticed how the sunlight caught the silver in her hair, how her eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, seemed to look through him rather than at him. For the briefest moment, he felt like he was the one being tested, not her. The thought was as unsettling as it was absurd. The elderly woman adjusted her glasses and spoke in a voice that carried surprisingly well across the lecture hall. The relationship between supersymmetry and string theory is particularly elegant, she began. In compactified dimensions, supersymmetry can be preserved through careful consideration of the Calabi-Yau manifolds. The topology of these manifolds determines which symmetries survive compactification. She paused, glancing around at the students' fascinated faces before continuing. Of course, this raises interesting questions about moduli stabilization. Recent work suggests that flux compactifications might offer solutions that preserve some supersymmetry while fixing the troublesome moduli. Thomas felt his face grow warm. Her answer wasn't just correct. It showed a deep understanding of cutting-edge theoretical work. He cleared his throat and walked briskly to the whiteboard, picking up a marker to regain control of his classroom. Let's test this knowledge with something more concrete, he said, quickly writing out a complex equation. It was from his own published work, a mathematical representation of quantum interactions that had earned him significant praise. This equation, he said, turning back to face the elderly visitor, describes a specific quantum interaction. Can you identify the error I've deliberately introduced? The students looked back and forth between their professor and the mysterious woman, the tension in the room palpable. Thomas stood with his arms crossed, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew there was no error. This was his flawless work. He simply wanted to watch her struggle with it. The woman peered at the board, her eyes narrowing slightly. After a moment, she smiled. Interesting approach, Professor. However, if this is meant to represent what I think it does, there's an issue with your third term. She pointed to a specific part of the equation. The coefficient should be negative, not positive. Otherwise, it violates conservation of energy in certain boundary conditions. Thomas's smile froze. He stepped back to the equation, examining it closely. A cold feeling washed over him as he realized she was right. It wasn't an error he had introduced intentionally. It was a genuine mistake, one he had never caught himself. His mind raced. How had he missed this? More importantly, how had she spotted it so quickly? Ah, yes, he said, his voice tight as he corrected the sign. That was the deliberate error. Well spotted. A few students exchanged glances. David Chen in the front row frowned slightly, clearly recognizing that the professor hadn't planted any error deliberately. Thomas could feel his authority slipping away with each passing minute. Perhaps we should return to the scheduled lecture, the woman suggested kindly. I didn't mean to derail your plan for today. Her tone was gentle, without a hint of smugness, which somehow made it worse. Thomas felt like he was being handled, patronized by this stranger who had wandered into his domain. He shook his head, forcing a tight smile. Actually, I find this quite educational for all of us. He turned to the class. This demonstrates an important principle in science. Always be prepared to have your ideas challenged. A few students nodded, though most seemed uncomfortable with the growing tension. Thomas walked to his desk and pulled out a journal article, his most recent publication. Since we have such a knowledgeable guest, he said, his voice edged with sarcasm, perhaps she could comment on more recent developments. This paper discusses a novel approach to reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity. He held up the journal so the class could see his name prominently displayed as the lead author, then turned to the woman. Have you had a chance to review this work? It was only published last month. The challenge was clear. No matter how well-read she was, she couldn't possibly be familiar with his newest research. This would finally put her in her place. The woman's expression remained placid. Is that your paper on non-commutative geometry as a bridge between quantum field theory and gravitation? Thomas blinked in surprise. You've read it? Yes, I found it quite stimulating, she replied. Particularly your application of Hopf algebraic structures to the problem. Though I wondered about your treatment of the background independence issue on page 27. A student in the third row raised his hand hesitantly. Professor Wilson, is she talking about the part where you argue that background independence emerges naturally from your formulation? Thomas nodded stiffly, trying to hide his astonishment. That was exactly the section she had referenced, a technical point buried deep in his paper. Yes, that's correct, he managed. And what exactly did you find questionable about my treatment? He asked the woman, his scientific curiosity momentarily overriding his wounded pride. Well, she said, opening her worn handbag to extract a small notebook, I've been playing with the equations myself, and I found that if you relax your initial constraints slightly, the background independence becomes more robust against certain quantum fluctuations. She began to write in her notebook, then paused. Would you mind if I came to the board? It might be easier to show rather than tell. The request placed Thomas in an impossible position. To refuse would seem petty and unscientific. To agree would further cede control of his classroom. After a moment's hesitation, scientific curiosity won out. By all means, he said, stepping aside with a sweeping gesture that attempted to convey he was still in charge. The woman rose slowly from her seat, joints clearly stiff with age. As she made her way down the steps to the front of the lecture hall, Thomas noticed details he had missed before. Despite her modest dress, she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Her movements were deliberate, her back straight. Up close, her eyes were sharp and clear behind her simple glasses. Taking the marker from Thomas's outstretched hand, she began writing on the board. Her handwriting was neat and precise, the mathematical symbols flowing across the white surface with practiced ease. If we consider this alternative formulation, she explained, adding equations that extended Thomas's work, we can preserve the essential insights of your approach while addressing the background independence more thoroughly. The students watched in fascination as she filled the board with elegant mathematics. Thomas stood to the side, his expression shifting from skepticism to reluctant interest. Despite himself, he was drawn into her reasoning. The equations were undeniably beautiful, and they connected to his work in ways he hadn't considered. "This is," he began, then stopped. He wanted to dismiss her work, to find some fundamental flaw, but his scientific integrity wouldn't allow it. "This is a fascinating extension," he admitted grudgingly. "Just a small refinement," she said modestly, returning the marker. "Your core insight is quite brilliant." The small compliment did nothing to soothe Thomas's wounded ego. Who was this woman? How did she know his work so intimately? And why did her small refinement feel like it had elevated his research beyond what he had envisioned? A student in the back raised her hand. "Professor, could we get our guest's name? It seems like she's made some important contributions to the field." All eyes turned expectantly to the elderly woman. Thomas realized he'd been so caught up in the intellectual sparring that he hadn't even asked her name. Basic courtesy had been abandoned in his rush to defend his academic territory. The woman smiled warmly at the student who had asked the question. "My name isn't important right now," she said. "I'm just an old woman who loves physics." "But clearly you're more than that," Thomas pressed, his scientific curiosity finally overcoming his bruised ego. "Your understanding of these concepts, your familiarity with my work, you must be in the field." "I've been around long enough to learn a few things," she replied enigmatically. Thomas glanced at his watch. They had already spent half the class time on this unexpected exchange. Despite his irritation, he had to admit that his students seemed more engaged than usual, watching the back and forth with rapt attention. "Well," he said, clapping his hands together, "this has been an interesting diversion, but we should return to our scheduled material." The woman nodded in agreement and turned to make her way back to her seat. As she did, Thomas noticed a small pin on her cardigan, a design he didn't immediately recognize. "Before we continue," he said, unable to resist one more attempt to understand who she was, "may I ask what brings you to my lecture today? Are you visiting the university?" She paused on the steps, turning back to face him with a gentle smile. "Let's just say I'm conducting a bit of research of my own," she replied. "Now please, don't let me interrupt any further." Thomas turned back to his lecture notes, determined to regain control of his classroom. The elderly woman had returned to her seat in the back row, once again taking notes in her small notebook as if nothing unusual had happened. "Now, as I was explaining before our interesting discussion," Thomas said, his voice carrying a forced lightness, "the implications of these theories extend beyond purely mathematical constructs." He launched back into his prepared lecture, but found himself stumbling over concepts he normally explained with effortless clarity. His mind kept drifting to the equations the woman had written on the board, extensions of his work that he should have seen himself. The elegant simplicity of her approach nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. In the third row, a student named Alex was no longer paying attention to the lecture. Instead, he was hunched over his laptop, typing rapidly. His friend Priya leaned over to whisper, "What are you doing?" "Searching for who she might be," Alex whispered back. Any elderly woman physicist who knows this much has to be someone important. At the podium, Thomas noticed the whispered exchange and frowned. "Is there something you'd like to share with the class?" he asked sharply. Alex looked up, startled. "No, Professor, sorry." Thomas nodded curtly and continued his lecture, but the damage was done. Other students had caught on to what Alex was doing, and soon several were discreetly searching on their phones beneath their desks. Thomas felt his frustration mounting. Not only had this stranger challenged his expertise, but she had now completely disrupted his carefully planned lecture. Students who normally hung on his every word were distracted, more interested in identifying the mysterious visitor than in learning from their esteemed professor. "Perhaps," Thomas said, setting down his notes with deliberate calm, We should embrace today's unexpected turn of events. Since our guest has shown such insight, let's pose a truly challenging problem. He turned to the woman with a tight smile. Would you indulge us once more? The woman looked up from her notebook, her expression serene. If you think it would benefit your students. Thomas turned to the whiteboard and began writing rapidly, filling it with complex equations. This was no ordinary problem. It was a theoretical puzzle that had been debated at a recent conference, one that combined aspects of quantum chromodynamics and general relativity in a particularly troublesome way. Even senior physicists had struggled with it. This, he announced to the class, represents one of the most perplexing open questions in theoretical physics today. At the Princeton Symposium last month, several leading minds proposed approaches to this problem, none fully successful. He turned to the elderly woman, unable to keep a note of triumph from his voice. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this particular challenge. The class fell silent. Even those who had been searching on their phones looked up, sensing that their professor had finally found a way to put the mystery woman in her place. The woman studied the board quietly for several long moments. Thomas felt a surge of satisfaction as the silence stretched out. Finally, she would be revealed as out of her depth. Interesting formulation, she said at last, though I might suggest that the problem itself contains a hidden assumption that makes it appear more challenging than it is. Thomas blinked. What assumption would that be? You're presuming that space-time remains smooth at quantum scales, she replied. If we instead allow for discrete granularity at the Planck length, as suggested by several quantum gravity approaches. She trailed off, looking thoughtful. May I? She asked, gesturing to the board again. The students looked eagerly between the woman and their professor. Thomas hesitated, then nodded stiffly. By all means. Once again, the elderly woman made her way to the front of the classroom. This time, Thomas noticed that several students were subtly taking photos with their phones. He couldn't blame them. This had become the most unusual lecture of the semester, perhaps of his entire teaching career. At the board, the woman began writing new equations alongside Thomas's original problem. Her hand moved confidently, laying out a mathematical framework that seemed both elegant and radical. If we approach it this way, she explained, the apparent contradiction resolves itself naturally. The discontinuity at quantum scales becomes a feature, not a bug. A student in the front row, Lily Wong, one of Thomas's brightest, gasped softly. That's brilliant, she whispered, just loud enough to be heard. Thomas stared at the board, his mind racing to follow the woman's logic. There was something familiar about her approach, something he'd seen before in... His thoughts were interrupted by Alex, who had suddenly straightened in his seat, eyes wide as he stared at his laptop screen. Professor, Alex called out, his voice filled with sudden excitement. Not now. Thomas cut him off sharply, still trying to process what the woman had written. Her solution was elegant, yes, but was it correct? He needed to focus. But Professor, I said not now. Thomas snapped, more harshly than he'd intended. The woman finished her explanation and placed the marker back in the tray. Of course, this is just one possible approach, she said modestly. There are likely others. Thomas found himself in the uncomfortable position of being genuinely impressed while still desperately wanting to find a flaw in her reasoning. He stepped closer to the board, examining her work with critical intensity. This approach bears some resemblance to work done by... he began, then trailed off as something clicked in his mind. He turned slowly to look at the elderly woman, really seeing her for perhaps the first time. Behind him, several students were now whispering urgently, phones being passed around, expressions of shock and awe spreading across their faces. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from tension to something approaching reverence. Thomas was about to speak when the door at the back of the lecture hall opened, and Professor Robert Huang, the department chair, stepped in. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes landing on the elderly woman at the front. I was told you might be here, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent hall. When your assistant called to say you were visiting campus today, I should have guessed you'd find your way to our most energetic young professor. The elderly woman smiled warmly. Robert, it's been too long. I hope you don't mind my dropping in unannounced. For you? Never, Professor Huang replied, beaming. He turned to address the stunned class. "Students, I see you've had the extraordinary privilege today of meeting one of the most brilliant minds in modern physics, though perhaps you didn't realize it." Thomas felt his stomach drop. The strange familiarity of her approach to the problem, the pin on her cardigan that he hadn't quite recognized, it was all coming together now. At the back of the room, Alex couldn't contain himself any longer. "It's Dr. Eleanor Winters," he blurted out. "She won the Nobel Prize in Physics 15 years ago. Her picture is literally on the wall in the main hallway." A wave of excited murmurs swept through the classroom. Several students had already found her online and were staring in disbelief, between their screens and the unassuming elderly woman standing beside their professor. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as the full impact of the situation hit him. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the Eleanor Winters, author of the groundbreaking Winters theory of quantum gravity, which had revolutionized theoretical physics. Her work was referenced in the very textbook he assigned to his class, and he had spent the past hour trying to publicly embarrass her. "Dr. Winters," he said, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I had no idea. I didn't recognize." Dr. Winters smiled kindly at him. "No need for that, Professor Wilson. It's been many years since my picture was taken for those dusty award ceremonies. Besides, I rather enjoyed our discussion." Professor Huang looked between them with interest. "I take it you two have been having a productive academic exchange?" Before Thomas could respond, a student called out, "Professor Wilson has been challenging Dr. Winters to solve increasingly difficult physics problems, and she's been absolutely crushing it." Another added, "She even found a mistake in his published paper." Professor Huang raised his eyebrows, giving Thomas a look that promised a private conversation later. "Well then," he said smoothly, "it sounds like an educational morning for everyone." Thomas stood frozen, his career flashing before his eyes. He had publicly challenged and attempted to humiliate one of the most respected figures in his field, someone whose endorsement could make or break a young physicist's career. And he had done it in front of a classroom full of students who would undoubtedly share this story far and wide. "Dr. Winters," Professor Huang continued, "I know you have a busy schedule, but would you consider joining us for lunch? The department would be honored." Dr. Winters glanced at Thomas, who stood rigid with mortification. "Actually," she said, "Professor Wilson and I were just getting to the most interesting part of our discussion. Perhaps he and I could continue our conversation privately, before I meet with the department." Thomas looked at her in surprise, not sure whether to be grateful for the apparent lifeline or terrified of facing her alone. "Of course," Professor Huang agreed. "Thomas, why don't you wrap up your class early today? This is a rare opportunity." Trapped Thomas could only nod. "Class dismissed," he managed to say. "Please review chapters 7 and 8 for next time." The students filed out of the lecture hall in an excited buzz, many lingering to steal glances at Dr. Winters or take discreet photos. A few bolder ones approached her directly, asking for autographs on their textbooks or notebooks. She obliged each one with a warm smile and a few kind words, showing none of the impatience or superiority that often accompanied academic fame. Thomas stood to the side, gathering his notes with unsteady hands. His mind raced through the morning's events, each memory more mortifying than the last. He had attempted to humiliate Eleanor Winters, the Eleanor Winters, in front of his students. His career might very well be over. Professor Huang approached him as the last students reluctantly left the hall. "I'll expect a full report on this unusual lecture," he said quietly. His tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "Dr. Winters is not just a distinguished colleague, but a major donor to the university." Thomas swallowed hard. "Of course, Robert. I'll explain everything. See that you do." Huang turned to Dr. Winters with a much warmer expression. "Eleanor, I'll have lunch prepared in the faculty lounge at 1. Take all the time you need with Professor Wilson." After Huang left, an awkward silence filled the now empty lecture hall. Thomas busied himself erasing the whiteboard, unable to meet Dr. Winters' gaze. The equations, his and hers, disappeared under his vigorous strokes, but the memory of her elegant solution remained burned into his mind. "You know," Dr. Winters said finally, settling into a chair in the front row, "your work on non-commutative geometry really is quite remarkable. With a few refinements, it could open entirely new avenues of research." Thomas turned, marker still in hand. "You actually read my paper? Before today?" "Of course," she replied. I make a point of following promising new approaches. Your name has come up in several interesting contexts over the past few years. Thomas felt a complex mixture of pride and shame wash over him. Eleanor Winters had known who he was, had read his work, and then he had treated her like an ignorant interloper. I don't know what to say, he admitted, setting down the marker. I behaved abominably today. Dr. Winters waved a hand dismissively. You didn't know who I was. That's no excuse, Thomas said, surprising himself with his honesty. I shouldn't treat anyone that way, regardless of who they are. He pulled a chair over and sat facing her, finally meeting her eyes directly. May I ask why you came to my lecture? And why you didn't simply introduce yourself? Dr. Winters smiled, the fine wrinkles around her eyes deepening. I was curious. Your papers show brilliance, but also a certain rigidity of thought. I wanted to see how you taught, how you handled questions and challenges. The classroom often reveals more about a scientist's mind than their published work. She adjusted her glasses thoughtfully. As for not introducing myself, well, that was perhaps a small test. Or maybe just the whim of an old woman who sometimes tires of being Dr. Eleanor Winters everywhere she goes. Thomas nodded slowly, beginning to understand. And did I pass your test? Partially, she replied with surprising candor. Your knowledge is impressive, your command of the material excellent. Your students respect you, that much is clear. She paused, studying him carefully. But you're missing something essential, something that took me many years to learn myself. What's that? Thomas asked, leaning forward despite himself. The humility to be wrong, she said simply. The willingness to learn from anyone, regardless of their title or position or age. Science isn't about being the smartest person in the room, Thomas. It's about pursuing truth wherever it leads and whoever points the way. Thomas felt her words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was normally more professional, more open-minded. But he knew she was right. His need to be the authority, to never show weakness or uncertainty, had been growing alongside his reputation. When I was about your age, Dr. Winters continued, her voice softening, I was much the same. I had just published the early work that would eventually lead to my breakthrough theory. People were beginning to notice me. I thought I knew everything worth knowing in my field. She smiled at the memory. Then I attended a conference in Geneva. During my presentation, an undergraduate student, just a bachelor's student who had somehow wrangled an invitation, raised his hand and asked a question that completely unraveled my central argument. Thomas raised his eyebrows. What did you do? Oh, I did exactly what you did today, she chuckled. I tried to embarrass him, to expose his ignorance, to protect my ego. I failed spectacularly, of course. His observation was entirely correct. She leaned back in her chair, looking past Thomas as if seeing that moment from long ago. That public humbling was the best thing that ever happened to me professionally. It forced me to reconsider everything, to question my assumptions. 3 months later, I had the breakthrough that eventually led to my Nobel work. And the student? Thomas asked, genuinely curious now. He's now the director of CERN, Dr. Winters said with a smile. We still correspond regularly. He never lets me forget our first meeting, though we laugh about it now. Thomas absorbed this, feeling something shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a scientist, a teacher. I've been approaching this all wrong, haven't I? Not all wrong, Dr. Winters corrected him. Your passion for physics is genuine. Your talent is real. But yes, your focus has been misaligned. She reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out a folder. I didn't come to your lecture merely to observe, though that was part of it. I have a proposal for you. Thomas took the folder cautiously. Inside was a research prospectus outlining a collaborative project between Harvard and 3 other universities, focusing on experimental verification of certain aspects of quantum gravity theory. We need someone with your particular expertise, Dr. Winters explained. Someone who can bridge the theoretical framework with practical experimental design. Your paper suggested you might be that person, but I needed to meet you to see if you had the temperament for true collaboration. Thomas looked up from the papers, stunned. And after today, you still want me involved? Dr. Winters smiled. Today showed me that you have both flaws and potential, like any good scientist. The question is whether you can learn from this experience. She stood up, smoothing her faded cardigan. The project begins in 3 months. That should give you enough time to decide whether you're interested, and whether you're willing to approach it with the right mindset. Thomas rose as well, still holding the folder. I don't need 3 months, he said quietly. I would be honored to be part of this, and I promise you I will do better. Today has been educational. Good. Dr. Winters nodded. Though I suggest you take some time to consider it anyway. Read the full proposal. Discuss it with your department. Make sure it aligns with your own research goals. She gathered her notebook and handbag. And perhaps consider how you'll explain today's lecture to your students when they return for your next class. They witnessed something important, though they may not fully understand what it was. Thomas hadn't even thought about facing his students again. They had seen their esteemed professor act like an intellectual bully, only to be humbled by the very person he was trying to embarrass. How could he face them again with any authority? As if reading his thoughts, Dr. Winters added, True authority comes not from being infallible, Thomas, but from being honest, especially about our mistakes. Your students might respect you more, not less, if you acknowledge what happened here. She extended her hand and Thomas shook it, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment, gratitude, and something like hope. Shall we head to lunch? She asked. I believe Robert is gathering quite a crowd of your colleagues, all eager to hear how you and I came to our understanding. Thomas winced at the thought of facing the entire physics department after the morning's events, but he nodded. After you, Dr. Winters. Eleanor, please, she corrected him with a smile. We'll be colleagues soon enough if all goes well. Together they walked toward the door, an unlikely pair, the young professor whose worldview had been shaken to its core, and the elderly Nobel laureate who had once stood exactly where he was standing now. Tell me, Dr. Winters said as they left the lecture hall, have you considered the implications of your non-commutative approach for quantum computing? Because I have some thoughts on that you might find interesting. The faculty lounge buzzed with excitement. News of Dr. Eleanor Winters' surprise visit had spread throughout the physics department, faster than light through a vacuum. By the time Thomas and Dr. Winters arrived, the normally spacious room was packed with professors, postdocs, and graduate students, all eager to catch a glimpse of the legendary physicist. Thomas felt a knot in his stomach as they entered. He could already see the curious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly as people noticed him walking beside Dr. Winters. Word of his classroom humiliation had clearly traveled fast. Professor Huang rushed forward to greet them. Eleanor! And Thomas. Wonderful, wonderful. We've prepared a small reception. Nothing fancy, but it's perfect, Robert, Dr. Winters said warmly. Though I hope there's food involved. Challenging young professors works up quite an appetite. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Thomas forced a smile, his face warm with embarrassment. Dr. Winters placed a gentle hand on his arm, a small gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the onlookers. As they moved through the room, Thomas found himself introduced to senior faculty members he'd barely spoken with before, all of whom suddenly seemed intensely interested in his work, now that he had Dr. Winters' apparent approval. The irony wasn't lost on him. So, Wilson, said Professor Diaz, a senior theoretical physicist whose attention Thomas had been trying to attract for months, Eleanor tells me you're doing some interesting work on non-commutative geometry. I'd love to hear more about it. Yes, well, Thomas began, unsure how to respond. Thomas has some truly innovative ideas, Dr. Winters interjected smoothly. In fact, we've been discussing a possible collaboration. His theoretical framework paired with the experimental approach we're developing could be quite powerful. Thomas glanced at her in surprise. She hadn't mentioned discussing their potential collaboration with others. Throughout lunch, Thomas watched Dr. Winters with growing admiration. She navigated the social dynamics of the department with effortless grace, deflecting excessive praise, asking thoughtful questions of even the youngest graduate students, and somehow managing to make everyone feel valued, all without diminishing her obvious brilliance or authority. It was a masterclass in scientific leadership, so different from his own approach of intellectual domination and competition. You know, said a voice beside him, I had you all wrong. Thomas turned to find Professor Huang taking the empty seat next to him, a plate of sandwiches in hand. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Huang nodded toward Dr. Winters, who was deep in conversation with a group of graduate students across the room. When she told me she wanted to visit your class specifically, I assumed you two had some prior connection. Then when I heard what happened, He shook his head with a slight smile. Well, let's just say I was preparing for damage control. You're not the only one, Thomas admitted. I thought my career might be over. Instead, she's singing your praises to anyone who'll listen. Even hinting at future collaboration. Huang studied him curiously. Whatever you said to her after class must have been impressive. Thomas looked down at his plate. Actually, I didn't say much. I mostly listened. He met Huang's gaze. It turns out I have a lot to learn. Not just about physics, Huang clapped him on the shoulder. That may be the wisest thing I've ever heard you say, Wilson. As the lunch reception wound down, Dr. Winters made her way back to Thomas. I'm afraid I need to head to the airport soon, she said. But I wanted to thank you for a stimulating morning. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. I should be thanking you. For the opportunity, for your mentorship, for not destroying my career when you had every reason to. Dr. Winters laughed. The world of physics doesn't need fewer bright minds, Thomas. It needs better ones, more complete ones. She handed him a business card with her personal email address handwritten on the back. Keep me updated on your progress with those equations we discussed. And think about what we talked about. I will, Thomas promised, on both counts. After Dr. Winters departed, accompanied by Professor Huang, who insisted on seeing her to her taxi, Thomas found himself alone in the gradually emptying faculty lounge. The events of the day swirled in his mind, the public humbling, the private conversation, the unexpected opportunity. He felt changed, as if some fundamental constant in his personal equation had been altered. His phone buzzed with a reminder. He had another class to teach in 20 minutes. His stomach tightened at the thought. Word of this morning's incident would have spread throughout the student body by now. How would he face them? Dr. Winters' words came back to him. True authority comes not from being infallible, but from being honest, especially about our mistakes. Thomas gathered his notes and headed to his next class with a new resolve. 2 days later, Thomas stood before his advanced theoretical physics class again. The room was even more crowded than usual, apparently. His encounter with Dr. Winters had made him something of a campus celebrity. He spotted Alex in the third row, sitting with Priya and several other students from the previous lecture. They watched him with undisguised curiosity, clearly wondering how he would address what had happened. Before we begin today's material, Thomas said, setting his notes aside, I want to talk about Tuesday's class. The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. Many of you witnessed an unusual lecture, to say the least, he continued. You saw me attempt to challenge and, yes, embarrass someone I perceived as an uninformed intruder in our classroom. And you saw that backfire quite spectacularly. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Thomas smiled, allowing the moment of levity. What you witnessed wasn't just a famous physicist putting an arrogant professor in his place, though I'm sure that made for excellent social media content. This time, the laughter was more genuine. What you witnessed was something far more valuable. The scientific process in action. Thomas moved out from behind the podium, something he rarely did during lectures. Science isn't about being right all the time. It's about pursuing truth, testing ideas, and being willing to learn from anyone who has insight to offer, regardless of their title or position. He was echoing Dr. Winters' words now, but they felt right, authentic to who he wanted to be as a scientist and teacher. Dr. Winters taught me a valuable lesson, one I hope you all take to heart as well. The moment we believe we have nothing to learn from others is the moment we stop growing as scientists. Thomas noticed Alex nodding thoughtfully in the third row. Now, that said, Thomas continued with a smile, I don't encourage you all to start challenging everything I say in class. More laughter. But I do encourage you to question, to explore, to push boundaries, both mine and your own. That's how science moves forward. He returned to the podium and picked up his notes. And with that bit of unexpected wisdom from your allegedly brilliant professor, let's get back to quantum field theory, shall we? The class felt different that day. Students asked more questions, engaged more deeply with the material. Thomas found himself enjoying the back and forth, the collaborative exploration of complex ideas. He even admitted when he wasn't certain about something, a first for him in the classroom. After class, Alex approached the podium. Professor Wilson, I just wanted to say, that was really cool what you said today, about science and learning and stuff. Thomas smiled. Thank you, Alex. Though I think the credit goes to Dr. Winters, not me. Maybe. Alex replied. But it takes a certain kind of person to learn a lesson like that so quickly. My other professors would have just pretended nothing happened. As Alex left, Thomas gathered his notes, thinking about Dr. Winter's research proposal sitting on his desk at home. Last night he had read it thoroughly for the first time, focusing on the science rather than the opportunity it represented for his career. The project was genuinely fascinating, pushing boundaries in exactly the areas he found most compelling. He had already drafted an email to Dr. Winters with several questions and ideas, written in a tone of collaboration rather than competition, a tone that would have been foreign to him just days ago. Thomas's phone buzzed with a new email notification. It was from Dr. Winters. Thomas, it read. I've been thinking more about your approach to non-commutative geometry. There's something there that connects to work being done at CERN right now. Are you free for a video call tomorrow to discuss? I've taken the liberty of inviting my old friend, that former student I mentioned. I think the three of us might have a very interesting conversation. Thomas smiled as he typed his reply. I would be honored, he wrote. And I have some new ideas I'd like to run by both of you. 6 months ago, he might have guarded his new ideas jealously, sharing them only in published form where his brilliance could be properly credited. Now he understood that science advanced through collaboration, through the humble exchange of ideas, even half-formed ones. As Thomas walked across the Harvard campus that afternoon, the autumn sunlight gilded the old buildings in warm gold. He felt lighter somehow, as if he'd set down a heavy burden he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying, the burden of always needing to be the smartest person in the room.